Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tonight on the show, we will be discussing the impact of Chinese foreign direct investments in Malaysia. Terence is professor at the Faculty of Economics at University Malaya, and Cheong he is with the Europe Institute, and they're two out of the four co-authors of the recently released book, China in Malaysia, State Business Relations and the New Order of Investment Flows. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. It's good to have you both here. I do want to talk a little bit about the book, particularly in relation to China's Belt and Road Initiative. How important, and I'm going to begin with you, Casey, how important is Malaysia to China's BRI? I mean, it was announced in 2013. And we've had, we've seen several years of this. How important is Malaysia as part of this initiative for Xi Jinping? Casey?
I think Malaysia is an important node in the maritime Silk Road. They're not important for the land base, but for the maritime part, it's quite important because of the Straits of Malacca. It's a major waterway through which China's oil passes. And so it's of strategic importance to China in Malaysia, because that's why they're building Kuantan port and the Malacca port and other things like that. It's a way to escape the chokehold of the Western countries like in Singapore and all that. So it's for them is strategic for
right. So the question is the strategic value. Is it both economic as well as military? Because we hear this term that's bandied about, a string of pearls that is associated with port building in Sri Lanka and various in Pakistan and such. How do you see those two elements coming together, the economic as well as the military dimensions of that strategic value?
I think the economic is a part of the story, but it's not the most important story. The military part is your guess as well as mine. Because I think the moment they build these ports, they can house military equipment and things like that. So it's
right. Terence?
To my mind, we can focus best on the economic dimension because there we have tangible evidence of outcomes. I agree with Cheok. On a military dimension, it's hard to say. There's no evidence with which we can speak with any authority on. But when it comes to the economy, there has been this inflow of investments. We have studied the outcomes of the investments, and then we can from there gather certain views as to how the Malaysian economy is going. So I feel, better equipped to talk about the economy because we have data from which we can get insights into what China is doing in the region.
Okay, on that note then, how important, if I may flip my original question, how important are Chinese investments to the Malaysian economy? Terence?
There's a history to this which, if you don't mind, I'd like to get into. For me, the defining moment was 2013. At that time, the Prime Minister, Najib Razak, had done badly in the general election, and he came out with a Bumiputra economic empowerment policy. Now, when he did that, it, to my mind, undermined investor confidence. So how do you generate new investments when you have a policy which Najib himself had admitted way back in 2009 that this policy had to be reviewed? How do you generate new investments? And this is where China comes in. 2013 is a defining moment because at that time Xi Jinping had come to power and he introduced the Belt Road Initiative. And so we see here a confluence of interest between Najib, the strongman of Malaysia, and Xi Jinping, the strongman of China, both having their economic agenda as well as political agenda, coming together, and both of them using state-owned enterprises, or we call them GLCs. So here we have two strong states with powerful leaders in control of very powerful state-owned enterprises. And they too can meet and dictate the agenda on investment flows. And that's why you'll see from 2015 a huge inflow of investments from China into the country. Okay. And it's very important for Malaysia because Malaysia runs on FDI. That's our history. We are highly dependent on FDI for growth.
Casey, I do want to ask you, it's a very interesting suggestion. You said two giants, and I think in many of the minds of many of us, China actually is a larger giant than the Malaysian giant. Are the asymmetries between our two countries in terms of size of the economy and the potential that these economies have mean that we'll always be in a subservient position vis-a-vis China? Malaysia and China's relationship always one between a David and a Goliath. That's probably terrible metaphor because David actually does win that fight. but tell us.
Yeah, I think actually in a sense the relationship between China and Malaysia is partly geographical. China's always going to be there whether you like it or not. So there's no escaping from China, and the rise of China is I think it's just a matter of time. I think it will rise. Okay. So Malaysia will have to play an important role in relation to China, but make sure that it doesn't get all the stuff that China throws at us, you know. So the governance issues and things like that are important for us. Right. Malaysia's interest is also interesting in that of all the ASEAN countries, Malaysia's China investments are the most diversified of them all, most diversified.
Terence, can you speak to that? I mean, the nature of the investments. Casey mentioned it's diversified. What does that mean exactly?
Yes. Here one must also pay attention to the nature of the state. Now, in the past, the Malaysian government has important institutions such as MITI and MIDA, for example. What they do is they evaluate the investments, and they make sure that when these investments come into the country, they serve the interest of domestic enterprises. That could have been done even with China's investments coming into the country. But here, when we look at the nature of the state, we have to ask ourselves, where does the power lie? And much of our focus on the book is on power structures. And the power lies with the hegemonic political party, or the strong man, in this case, Najib Razak. And he can dictate the agenda. By that I mean ensuring that even bureaucratic institutions which have oversight of these investment flows, he can bypass them and ensure that the investment patterns that come into the country suit the interest of both his economic and political interests as well as that of China. And therein lies the problem. The level of devolution of power, of accountability and transparency in the investments. And that was the problem that we had with China's investments in our country.
All right, we'll definitely want to come back and talk a little bit about accountability and transparency in these investments. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more on Consider This, so stay tuned. Hi, if you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan, and we're speaking to the co-authors of China in Malaysia. It's a newly released book, Terence and Cheong. So, Casey, I want to come back. Oh, no, sorry, Terence, just before the break, we talked a little bit about transparency and accountability. And I want to ask you about the concerns surrounding China's investments into Malaysia and the issues of transparency and accountability. Who's watching these government-to-government negotiations? Who's ensuring that there's transparency and accountability built into these negotiations?
The next defining moment in Malaysia, if 2013 was the first one, the second one is 2018. In the run-up to the 2018 general election, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, at that time in the opposition, spoke at length about China's investments in this country, and he drew attention to the ECRL and the problems with the ECRL, which was inflated. He drew attention to the project down south in Johor, and he also noted what happened in Kuantan, the MCKIP project. And one must also remember the Malacca Gateway. We spoke about the ports and how important they are. And he did say there were a lot of problems with these investments. When he came to power, Mahathir and his government, I felt, were concerned about this, but didn't necessarily go all the way, even in their 2 years in the administration, to ensure these checks and balances were put in place. There are reasons for that. Again, we go back to the nature of the state. Now, on one hand, I would argue that Mahathir was also looking upon the economy. And when he came to power, his first interest was to go to Japan, to bypass China. But nothing much happened out of that. And then you see the shift towards China, and then ECRL is back on the drawing board. Projects like Bandar Malaysia and the Malacca Gateway are back on the board, because Mahathir recognized whatever it is, we do need these investments if you want economic growth. But, and herein lies the problem, how much transparency and accountability was there also in these major infrastructure projects, such as ECRL and Malacca Gateway and the project in Johor. There were issues there too. We didn't get to solve those problems because the government fell unexpectedly. But these are important points about how we must institutionalize these reforms.
Casey, somebody who's worked in the World Bank and, and all your experience, your understanding of China, I think is what I'm interested in. Does China in its system create internal checks, regulatory checks that maybe are different from how MNCs operate, but nevertheless ensure that SOEs don't overspend, do not engage in practices that might be detrimental in the long run?
Yeah.
How do we understand China's own practices that might impinge on our relationship, Malaysia and China?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the Chinese is that basically SOEs are very powerful. In fact, some of them are so powerful that even the ministers are now they cannot control these guys because they're so big, So there's not really checks and balances on the Chinese side. Now, the other side of the coin is that when China comes to Malaysia, China believes in the policy of non-interference, which means that if Najib misbehaves, he just does it, and China will condone what he's doing. So in that sense, the checks and balances are really absent, and China hasn't got used to listen to civil society like in Malaysia. So
Well, Casey, I want to ask you about debt trap diplomacy. That's been, widely kind of written about or talked about, especially amongst Western media. This long-standing apprehension surrounding Beijing-linked projects, and and the investments in countries whereby if countries find themselves unable to repay those loans, they then have to make concessions. And the very famous case is the Sri Lankan case of the Hambantota port, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Is that a legitimate concern that countries in which China invests in should have debt trap?
Actually, this debt trap issue it takes a long time to explain, but I think in some ways it's overblown, because the debt trap is sometimes traps basically Chinese companies as well as the companies.
It goes both ways.
Yeah. But the Chinese acknowledge that they may have a problem by loading countries with debt and things like that.
To what extent, Casey, are all parties in this BRI initiative learning, and recalibrating constantly the terms of which this whole project is being rolled out?
I think it is happening, as is clear from the second forum that they had, that China is aware that they may have created these problems for countries. But then at the same time, if you look at the debt forgiveness among the Chinese, they're also quite high. They don't enforce a lot of debt collection and stuff like that. So it's
Terence?
both positive and negative.
Would you like to weigh in on debt trap diplomacy?
I would like to take it off on a slight tangent, because here we are focusing a lot of attention only on state-owned enterprises. But I'd like to draw attention to the book and what the book said. When we saw investments coming in from China, it was not just from state-owned enterprises. There were also privately owned firms from China that were investing in this country. So let's not forget that story. And these private firms, and if you read the book, what we do show is these private firms are also highly industrialized companies with technological know-how, which have come and embedded themselves here and build up thriving enterprises. And that's also been good for the economy. So I don't want to paint the picture it's been all bad and that we're getting ourselves into a debt trap, because there has been extremely important economic benefits also from these industrial firms that have come into the economy.
Are there structural problems that you discovered, especially on the Malaysian side, when you did your research? I mean, what exactly are the deficits on our side in terms of this relationship?
We learned a lot about Malaysia from studying these investments. It confirmed in our minds some of the major structural problems in this country. Now, as Casey pointed out, these firms from China don't mind transferring technology. This technology should be transferred to small and medium scale enterprises. But the concern we had was, do these SMEs have the know-how, the ability to understand this technology and take it and build on it? They don't. And in fact, one of the big problems is we found these SMEs couldn't compete with these firms because they just were out of their depth compared to these major enterprises. Now, what this reflected is our SMEs don't invest enough in R&D. And the volume of R&D in this country as to GDP is very small. And this is something we have talked about for a long time. The second problem was about the human capital. Do they even have the human capital who have the ability to understand this technology and build this technology? No, they don't. And this points to the other major structural problem we have in this country, and we've been talking about it for a long time, the quality of our public education system. Are we churning out the kinds of people, young people with the know-how, with the knowledge to build on these technology?
So we're getting the gift of technology, but we're not necessarily knowing how to unwrap it, as it were.
The problem is, if we haven't dealt with these problems, then these companies from China will gain supremacy in our economy. They will become the dominant actors in our economy. That means, in the long run, we will become extremely dependent on these companies. And that's a story also that must be told. We say in the short term, they're very good outcomes. But what about the long-term implications? And what if these companies leave the country and they're going to invest elsewhere? Then we have a serious problems on our hands. Who's going to take this forward?
Okay, we're going to take another quick break. We'll be back with more on Consider This. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kuttan, and we're chatting tonight to the co-authors of China in Malaysia, Terence and Cheong. They've just released this new book, which is very readable, about the impact of the investments, China's investments here in the Malaysian economy. Terence, I want to come back and talk a little bit about the outcome of this book, right? Now that the book is out there, what did we learn about the new forms of state-business relations when it comes to Malaysia and China, Terence?
The primary theme of the book is state-business relations, and we wanted to show there's something very important that is changing in the nature of state-business relations. Normally, when we talk about state-business relations, we say public-private partnerships.
Yes.
But now what we are seeing is public-public partnerships. SOEs, GLCs in partnership. This is a major transformation in state business relations. The other dimension that we were looking at is what we call the three different types of hands available. The three hands are the invisible hand, the helping hand, and the grabbing hand. The invisible hand is when the government creates general policies to get investments into the country. That's always been there. Then we have the helping hand. The helping hand is when the government creates incentives for particular companies to go into particular sectors of the economy. And the third one is the grabbing hand. The grabbing hand is when we see a lot of corruption because of state business relations, public, strong men dictating the agenda. A lot of grabbing hand tendencies, rent-seeking, corruption can emerge. But interestingly enough, in this book, when we studied the industrial sector, and our focus is only on the industrial sector, what we saw a lot of was helping hand. And that's why the book is not telling a story which is all dire. The book is really telling a story also of how the government can play a good role. Two good government leaders coming together can actually facilitate investment flows that can benefit both countries. That is also the story which is there, if we have an accountable and transparent government on both sides.
Okay, so avoid the grabbing hand.
That's right.
Okay. Casey, I wanted to ask you for your sense of what the future might bring. Malaysia we started with the Najib Xi Jinping pairing.
Yes.
Najib is no longer, it was succeeded by Dr. Mahathir. Now we have Muhyiddin Yassin. Because we're democratic, we've had change. China, we seem to assume is stable, but is it? And is Xi Jinping, supreme leader that he is now, on par with Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, is he there forever? Could policies change? What would lead that to change, and so on and so forth? What's your sense of things on the Chinese side?
Well, my sense about the Chinese, though, is that Xi Jinping is quite firmly established in his own position. So for now, I don't think he's going to make any changes and all that. So the problem with Xi Jinping is that he also assumes that the other leaders in ASEAN are also like him, which is a mistake, you know.
Because they are susceptible to democratic pressures.
Yes. But let me add something. Terence has written a paper on powerful people who make deals with each other, which is very interesting because they basically bypass the other parts of the government. I mean, they just make the deal. Xi Jinping, Najib, Xi Jinping, Duterte, people like that. I mean, they can unfreeze the logjam very quickly by doing things like that. I think let Terence tell you about it.
The story we must understand here is that we have different types of states among ASEAN countries. If you look at Cambodia and Hun Sen, he can have a direct relationship with Xi Jinping, and you can see the volume of investments into Cambodia is huge. If you look at the relationship between Duterte and President Xi, you can also see the same relationship here, which, as Cheok has just said, can facilitate inflows. This also serves as a mechanism for them to bypass powerful oligarchs in their own countries. We have seen in Indonesia that there is evidence that Jokowi also seems to have tied up a relationship with China where SOEs work with SOEs, and thereby allowing him to also bypass oligarchs in Jakarta. And then we have other countries like Singapore and Thailand. It's a different story. Singapore doesn't seem to have that kind of relationship with China. And Thailand, which is basically under military rule, has a very different relationship from China. So different countries have different stories to tell, depending again on the nature of the state. And that's what Xi Jinping also has to look at. I agree with Cheok. I don't know whether they're paying enough attention to the nature of the state and how it's so different among ASEAN countries.
Maybe we should send him a copy of your book.
I hope you will.
And you know, in the couple minutes that we have left, I do want to look forward and see what headwinds lie in the future, what potential lies in the future. Casey, do you see any potential headwinds in the future that could derail the economic relationship between Malaysia and China? I'm thinking off the top of my head issues like the South China Sea, issues like the Chinese government's policies in Xinjiang. What do you think? Casey, any potential headwinds?
I think the South China Sea issue is potentially quite destabilizing for China. However, the Chinese are able to engage in bilateral relations that basically undermine the ASEAN unity that we're supposed to build. So I'm not sure ASEAN can do very much about what the Chinese guys are doing. However, I think the South Chinese Sea relationship and the Malaysia relationship with China is a bit different. In the Malaysian case, China wants to make sure its shipping lanes are clear. The South China Sea issue, China wants to basically prevent the Americans from coming close to China.
And Terence, any headwinds? I mean, what would you advise the Malaysian government going forward to be mindful of in terms of this relationship?
Well, if they read the book carefully, they will see that we can have productive outcomes from investments from China. But here, the role of bureaucratic institutions become very important. I would like to leave the politicians out. And I hope the politicians will let the bureaucratic institutions come forward. MIDA, for example. Let them take charge. Let them determine the nature of the investments and whether these investments go into areas which are productive, and make sure that there are proper linkages with the SMEs so that there's at least some attempt to ensure that they come into the supply chains and there's some attempt to transfer technology, and I hope these SMEs can build on that.
Well, what about the structural, problems that you noted just now, including public education? How do we solve that? It's a big issue.
That's why if they look at the book carefully, they'll realize if we really want to benefit from China on equal terms, we first better solve our own structural problems. They are very dynamic small and medium scale enterprises, but they need the support of the government. And let me mention this also, 98% of the corporate sector are SMEs. And we want these SMEs to work with these enterprises from China. We want them to learn this technology. We want them to get into the global supply chain by working with these firms. There's so much good that can come out of this if we get our policies right.
Okay. So we're going to have to send them copies of your book too.
Okay.
Thank you for plugging my book so much.
Thank you so much,
For
both
being on
of
the
you,
show.
for being on the show
thank you for
today.
having us.
It's been a pleasure talking to you both. That's all the time we have on the show tonight. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.